Changes in the future of the fort. The official handover from the U.S. Army inches closer. Tonight, an update on Fort Monroe. This is What Matters. Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis. It's hard to believe that in less than 6 months, the Army will turn over the keys to Fort Monroe to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And since the fort sits at the environs of Hampton, the fort finds itself in a federal, state, local mix that's been tough to navigate. As the transfer gets closer, more eyes are on the fort, and tonight we'll get the next steps from Bill Armbruster. He's the executive director of the Fort Monroe Authority. Mark Perot is the president of Citizens for a Fort Monroe National Park, and the Honorable Molly Ward is the mayor of the city of Hampton. Good to have all of you with us tonight. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Bill, can you believe we are less than... reading that, I was just a little bit stunned by that. I think we've been talking about this since 2004, haven't we?
Absolutely. Kathy, it is amazing how quickly that time has gone by, but less than 6 months to go, but we're going to be ready. We're looking forward to having the opportunity to take control and manage and operate this historic treasure, which we want to share with the citizens of Virginia as well as the nation at large. We just expect it's going to be a great opportunity.
Indeed. Mayor Molly Ward, this plan has gone through a lot of iterations and a lot of discussion and reshaping and reconfiguration, but you got some really good news this month in terms of Park Service status.
Well, we have successfully, we got all the stakeholders and parties of interest together and got the FMA.
That's no small feat, by the way.
No, it isn't. And I want to compliment Mark Perot, who's here, and his citizens group for helping us really coalesce and get behind a vision. But we got the Fort Monroe Authority Board, the brand new board that was constituted last July 1st, to vote on a footprint and on some talking points for legislation. And then we also successfully got that map and draft legislation to Congressman Ridgell's office.
So as you think about what that map looks like now, how does it differ from what we've been talking about to date? What do you think what's it going to look like?
We would like the boundary of the park to encompass the entire peninsula. We think it's important for the stature of Fort Monroe that the entire peninsula be included, and we can say the entire fort is a park. We all think it's very important that a lot of the natural areas be included, and then the moat itself be included, and several important buildings within the moat and the parade grounds inside the moat.
And so how will you pay for that? Because one of the great concerns has been the Park Service is not flush with money. Who is these days, right? And then the conventional wisdom was you needed some development to be able to afford to create this space that you're looking at.
Right. Well, there are many examples throughout the country of the Park Service working with localities and with other entities to have a successful reuse and redevelopment. So we see a partnership in the future. In terms of federal dollars for the park, we don't think we can afford to let the federal government not pay to have a National Park Service unit at the fort. It's that important. It has that national significance and that stature in terms of our nation's history, and it deserves to be a National Park Service unit.
And Mark Perot, that has to be music to your ears. I know your group has fought for a long time for a larger footprint at Fort Monroe.
Well, that's right. In fact, if you go back to 2005, there was a lot of opposition to even a national park unit at all. Then after a lot of work, we got to the point where we would have some sort of presence, and now this is quite an achievement that we've got all the parties around in Virginia, a park that not only celebrates the history and the architecture of the core historic part of the fort, but the natural space, the open, and the Chesapeake Bay, and putting those two together and connecting them really fulfills the vision that we started with back in 2005.
So you are satisfied that this gets it done?
Well, there's a lot of details here, and we're still concerned about the scope of development at Fort Monroe. We have to keep that consistent with the grand public place, but we've got a framework here that seems like it could work, and I hope we stick by this vision, because we got some challenges yet ahead to actually realize it.
Yeah, indeed so. And if you have not lived in this community for long, you're seeing some pictures of Fort Monroe right now. It's one of the most beautiful places in Hampton Roads, without a doubt, but it also has tremendous historic significance. And so I think one of the recent editions of this broadcast where we have been checking on the progress of things all the way along, and so we bring you this report on the historical significance of Fort Monroe.
The fort's place in history cannot be denied. Not only has it been around for hundreds of years, but has housed famous Americans like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. The fort was built in 1819 on Old Point Comfort in what is now part of the city of Hampton. Its original mission was to protect Hampton roads from enemy attacks. To ensure that, Fort Monroe was armed with the most powerful artillery of that time, guns that could fire over a mile away. During the Civil War, Fort Monroe was the place where Major General Benjamin Butler refused to return escaped slaves to bondage, calling them contraband of war and giving thousands of slaves a place to seek their freedom. Fort Monroe was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1960.
But we want to open it up for all of our citizens to enjoy this beautiful place. We want to have them come in and enjoy the open space, the parks, the beaches, hiking, biking, kayaking on Mill Creek. We're standing inside the moat, and this is the most historic part of Fort Monroe. There will be no new construction in this area. What you see will be maintained. These are all on the historic register, so we'll look at adaptive reuse for all of these buildings.
Steve Corneliuson says all of Old Point Comfort is a national treasure with international significance.
That's the land that gives the setting to the moated fortress. That's the land that shows it in its historical significance. And we think that that land ought potentially to become mostly green space, not development space.
Both those for and against development on Old Point Comfort agree that it will cost about $7 million a year to maintain the property. Armbruster says after about 8 years, Fort Monroe should start generating money. It's also believed that once Fort Monroe opens to the public, it will draw at least 250,000 visitors a year. For What Matters, I'm Lisa Godley.
So we'll go back and do some fact checking here because that was some time ago. So we said $7 million a year. Still like those numbers?
That number is probably still pretty close to being accurate.
And after 8 years, we'll start.
We do expect that it will ultimately become economically sustainable.
But maybe not in 8 years.
It may take 10, but the economy we're dealing with an economy that has changed.
Well, this is a different economy that we started with in 2004, isn't it? And then about a $250,000 a year. Sorry, 250,000 visitors a year.
We
Still
think
like
that,
those numbers?
that figure is realistic. Again, it's a natural draw.
Sure.
We see the opportunity to have some synergy with Colonial Williamsburg, and we think we ought to be part of the Colonial Quadrangle.
That's right, the quadrangle, huh? There we go. Mark, you said there are still hurdles to overcome. What do you see as some of those hurdles?
Well, number one, we have to get legislation finalized that is consistent with what's been proposed, and then get that through the Congress. And that's getting anything through Congress right now is a challenge. And what I hope we will in Virginia stick to is that this vision, if we're not, it would be great to be immediately successful in the Congress, but if we're not, let's hold to the vision and keep working for it. We will be successful at some point in the Congress in getting this national park through.
Mayor Ward, you are a persistent person. I know this about you. And so while you were waiting on a plane with President Obama, you had Governor McDonnell and Senator Warner, a bunch of folks in the room all together, right? And you were really trying to hammer on them about
Take every
the importance
opportunity.
of this project.
If I'm on the dais with somebody or on the stage, if that's the only chance I'm going to get to talk to him, I get to talk to him. I was waiting for President Obama to get off the plane. I never got on Air Force One. I want to make that clear. I would have loved to have gone. But and this has really been a bipartisan effort. I want to say that too. Our entire congressional delegation, Congressman Forbes, Congressman Ridgel, Congressman Whitman, Congressman Scott, Senators Warner and Webb have been supportive and helpful at every step of the way. And then the Governor McDonnell, has been incredibly supportive and helpful. And Terry Suit, who was the chair of our board and a member of the governor's cabinet, could not be more supportive. And
you said you really think she was the key in some respects to bringing this whole to this final push.
Absolutely. She really, when she got appointed chair of the board, I believe it was just last August, and she had a brand new 11-member board to bring together and to move us this far in this short a period of time. You have to remember, we've only had 3 or 4 board meetings since sunset time plus a very difficult General Assembly session, yet we were able to get together and vote on this at the last board meeting. I think that's quite an accomplishment, and I really do compliment her and the governor's administration.
So if we take a look at this in the context of all the conversation we're having nationally about what the core functions of government are, I know you're in public life, so you've probably had that conversation from time to time when you had to defend something in the budget as being a core function of government or not. How do you make that argument for Fort Monroe as a national park at a time when the nation has so many spending priorities?
Well, first of all, we have lost so much African American history in this country and so much green space, as Mark will point out. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or once-in-hundreds-of-years opportunity to create a national park that deserves to happen because of the contraband slave story and many of the other historical things that happened at Fort Monroe. It's the most important fort in America. Destry Jarvis, who works with the National Park Conservation Association, said you can put all the other forts together and Fort Monroe is still more important.
Wow.
And so it deserves to be a national park.
And this contraband slave story, it seems to me, is important. It's something that has always been part of the history, but I think the Citizens for Fort Monroe National Park really sort of focused on that as something that was important to this conversation as well. Did that make a difference in the argument here, Mark?
I think it did. Yeah, and I think there's been this of course is a sesquicentennial,
right.
And this is we're going to celebrate it at Fort Monroe later this spring, the 100th anniversary of the 150th anniversary of the original Contrabands event. There's been a lot of publicity of the Emancipation Proclamation. Right. This is a step towards that, and I think that we're right on schedule for celebrating these things, and Fort Monroe is the place to do it.
And just to be clear, this is a circumstance where there were escaped slaves from the South who sought refuge at Fort Monroe, and the Union General Benjamin Butler, says, I will not return you. I accept you as contraband of war. And then this was the first step by which something on the order of, I think, 10,000 slaves eventually came to Fort Monroe.
And thousands, tens of thousands throughout the South came to Union-controlled properties and assisted in the Union war effort.
It's probably fair to say that was the beginning of the end, wasn't it?
Really was. It's a compelling story that we didn't learn. I didn't learn in my history book about the beginning of slavery at Fort Monroe and the beginning of the end of slavery at Fort Monroe. It is a remarkable story, and it's one we intend to tell in many ways, and that's part of what we want to do with the Park Service, is to make sure that that theme gets woven in.
And I know that's a goal of the Park Service as well,
Absolutely.
to engage more African Americans in U.S. parks. Mark Perot, you've been very vigilant about the environmental aspects of that property, and are you satisfied that this plan will achieve the protection that you were looking for environmentally?
Not entirely, but this is a major step forward because we're taking close to 200 acres at the north end and putting that under National Park Service management, and we know that they're the best people in the country in interpreting and taking care of open space and the bay. I mean, there's an effort separate from the efforts at Fort Monroe to create a Chesapeake Bay National Park unit. This could well be the southern portion of such a Chesapeake Bay National Park, in addition to a Fort Monroe National Historical Park.
And there are 3 parcels that do not convey. What's the story with those?
Maybe Bill wants to get into it a little bit more, but there's 3 parcels that don't automatically revert to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth claims that they should revert to the Commonwealth, and the Army says that they don't revert. So, but we're in negotiations with over 2 of the parcels to work out a deal. And it's friendly, it's an amicable disagreement.
It is, but back when the deeds were executed with the Commonwealth 150 years ago, there were reversionary clauses in those original deeds. Now, after that time, the northern area, the Dog Beach area, was actually property that was deeds where it was condemnation and separate deeds. It wasn't reversionary property. So there's no real dispute on that. But there are 2 parcels, and they happen to be right in the adjacent area to the Stone Fort. One is what we call the North Gate area. It's sort of the industrial area now, but has potential for reuse and mixed use in there. And then the other one is the area adjacent to the marina, and the marina is, of course, an important part of what we have.
That's a huge controversy, isn't it?
But rather than go to court and litigate, the Commonwealth and the Army agreed to work this out through negotiation, and we believe, in the final stages of getting that agreement We're working very closely with the Army so that we will share in some of the potential property sale, if that happens, to satisfy the Army requirements on this. But we're confident we're going to get an agreement.
It really makes you know, when you see these legal documents and they seem so complex and convoluted, it really lets you know why it's important, because 150 years later, you could still be talking about one small clause that could be hanging up the whole works. It's an interesting point.
The important thing is that the Dog Beach area does not revert to the Commonwealth, and we want that to be part of the national park, and it's a very important part of the natural area that we want to see preserved.
I know there are also people very concerned about the status of the marina.
Yes.
And what's going to happen with that?
The marina will stay open. Okay. That's a change, because the announcement went out last month from the Army that they would terminate leases on the current slip holders. The Army has seen fit to revisit that, and they will continue.
It sounds like there's a story there, Bill Armbruster. The Army has seen fit to revisit that.
We had a fruitful visit
we
to
had
the
a
Pentagon.
frank exchange of ideas.
Right.
Yes.
But it's important to keep that facility open, and the Army is going to have a caretaker status down there for some time. So the good news is the marina will continue to be open. There are some slips available, and currently, if you meet the requirements, DOD, military, you can get a slip out there. But our intent is to expand that.
Okay. Mayor Molly Ward, the city obviously picks up some duties in this transfer, right? So there are some services on Fort Monroe that the citizens will wind up paying for. Those are just beginning to sort of be clarified, right?
Right, and in fact, that's something else we've accomplished in just the last 6 months since Ms. Zook came on, and we had the new board constituted, and we successfully were able to get legislation introduced this last General Assembly session that really defined the relationship between the City of Hampton and FMA, which is another huge achievement to get done in such a small period of time. Essentially, the state will pay FMA will pay the city payment in lieu of real estate taxes, equivalent to what real estate taxes would be for city services, so that the citizens of Hampton, who are currently citizens of Hampton, Fort Monroe citizens will also be citizens of Hampton in the future, won't bear the burden of the services provided to Fort Monroe.
That was a very important point to get resolved.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was essential to the City of Hampton that the existing citizens didn't pick up the check.
And every time there's a new company that comes over the horizon with an idea of what to do with Fort Monroe, the anxiety sort of rises. You were pretty vocal this last time around and said this is not what we're interested in there.
Well, we're talking about the most recent housing development project. We think that the HRI, the developer, is a great developer. They've done amazing things throughout the country, so it wasn't an issue with the developer or with the FMA. The City of Hampton just felt that some of the buildings that they chose for redevelopment were not the best choices for redevelopment. But we hope that to do business with them in the future, and we look forward to some of the other deals coming forward. And once again, we're in a process, and Bill and I are still talking. So
this is a beautiful thing, and I've watched this progress over many years. So this is a good place we're in. So what parts of the fort will be then developed? I mean, what parts will be available for
Well, our
rental?
focus initially is to adaptively reuse the existing properties that we have. We've got an inventory of almost 2 million square feet of real estate. We want to keep those buildings occupied, and that's what we're trying to do, is to keep the residents in the residential units, expand that opportunity, and then adaptively reuse some of the office complexes that we have for business office space. We've got a state agency that we're working very closely to move down there. There's some others as well. What we're trying to do is to avoid what happens with base closures around the country, that is a empty building scenario where the service leaves, they turn out the lights, lock the doors, hand you the keys. We want to make this as much of a seamless transition as we can. And that's why we're doing this early leasing. We're keeping military families in there if they want to stay. We'll honor their current lease.
No, it's great.
That's something that isn't usually done on a base closure. That opportunity is there. And as I said, as the Army vacates, we're looking at a mix.
But you said that's important, because I know there's some residents who've raised a concern about security. And the more these things are occupied, the less of a concern you have about empty, vacant buildings being vandalized.
That is so important that we have those residents occupied and the buildings hopefully occupied.
So the gate goes away at Fort Monroe.
The gate goes away, but we're going to be working with the city on security. The city is going to provide us security and fire and emergency services.
5 officers.
As the mayor indicated, that's what the citizens will expect.
And so what happens, this just popped in my mind, and I realize I don't think I've ever asked you this. What happens to Chapel of the Centurion and some of those worship
I'm glad you asked. It will continue to be a religious house of worship. We have a lease that we're very close to executing with the congregation, so it will continue to be open.
It'll just be a civilian congregation.
Well, it'll be the same people going there.
That's what I mean.
You won't have a chaplain.
It won't be a base chapel. It'll be a community.
That's correct. Yeah. Those that want to have weddings in the chapel, that opportunity will still be there. The Star of the Sea, the Catholic Church, that's going to continue to operate. That belongs to the Diocese of in Richmond.
Yes. So
the churches will be occupied and will be open. The Casemate Museum, another example of an Army facility that was going to close. We have agreements with Army to keep the collection here, and we're going to partner in terms of operating that facility. So we're doing as much of that as we can. We've got some challenges, obviously, but that's our goal, is to keep it a vibrant community.
Sure.
That's what we want to do.
Bill, I was going to say, Bill was also very successful at the Pentagon getting the Army, I guess their museum wing, basically, to agree to leave some artifacts at the Chapel of the Centurion.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so, and leave them on loan to the chapel. And the individuals who are in charge of the museum collections at the Pentagon have been very involved at Fort Monroe, and had, I think one of them used to be stationed at Fort Monroe, and so very passionate about the collection, and it really was.
There is a concern here, though, that we're probably going to be working through this year, and that is whether the current model, which is that the state or the National Park Service would own all the land at Fort Monroe, whether we can maintain that. That's what the statute now contemplates. But there is an effort to reconsider that and perhaps sell homes or land to private individuals.
And where is that effort originating?
I think it's basically from some members of the Fort Monroe Authority staff, mainly, who are concerned, Fort Monroe Authority Board, who are concerned that there are some challenges with the leasing model, and they want to look at that very closely and decide whether it can work as to all the Fort Monroe Authority managed property, or some of it, or what. But there are concerns that our group has always had with private ownership. One is that you can't quite have the control over the use of the property and maintenance of the property when it's sold off, even with easements. A second one is the financial benefit. Once it's sold, there's no more money coming to the Fort Monroe Authority from the property.
But I tell you.
And then if you want to have a larger national park in the future, maybe you can't, because it's all sold off.
But you have to be I mean, and I accept that these points that still have to be negotiated. Boy, I tell you, we're a far lot closer in terms of these objectives than we have been before. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I'll be back in a moment with a final thought. In Fort Monroe, there is irony and opportunity. Here's the irony. We talked about it just a moment ago, that the first Africans arrived here near the fort around the time of the colony at Jamestown. And during the Civil War, the beginning of the end of slavery is marked by General Benjamin Butler, who, when 3 slaves escaped to Fort Monroe, refused to turn them back to the South, declaring them contraband of war. The beginning and the end, all in one place. Here's the opportunity. The U.S. Slavery Museum at Fredericksburg is doomed. The brainchild of Governor Doug Wilder, himself a grandson of slaves and the first elected black governor in the country, and the land that he has envisioned for the slavery site is about to be auctioned. Slavery Museum site is about to be auctioned for taxes. Fundraising is at an end, and the former governor is mum on the issue. But Governor Wilder could turn this around by getting behind the idea of putting the National Slavery Museum at Fort Monroe, whose heritage argues powerfully for that placement. Believe it or not, the Museum of the Confederacy has funded some of the most extensive research on slavery and still hopes to tell the slavery story in the context of the big battles that took place in Northern Virginia, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and the like. But what sparked the end of slavery wasn't a shot, it was shelter, and the recognition of human beings as individuals and not as the property of other human beings. So again, I will wonder aloud why Governor Wilder doesn't seize victory from the jaws of defeat and throw his support and the considerable support of his celebrity friends behind this idea. If anybody has his cell number, I'll be glad to make the call. Remember, if you want to watch this program again or any of our past broadcasts, just visit our website. That's whatmatters.tv. That's where you'll also find any number of ways to get in touch with us. And of course, you can join us as a fan on Facebook. On the radio for more local talk, I hope you'll also join us for Hearsay. That's noon to 1 on 89.5 WHRV FM. We'll take your calls each day at noon. Thanks again. I'm Kathy Lewis, and we'll see you next time. I don't even know my name, for another look at what matters.